This video is really an overview to the respiratory system and goes over some of the assumed knowledge, the prior knowledge that really start doing ASPE you should know from GCSE. Maybe a few little bits you're not quite so familiar with, but this is certainly the starting point, and there's very much more on the anatomical side. In later videos we'll look at more at the physiology, how things work and change. So good respiration or ventilation helps us perform in sporting exercise, and basically we're trying to get air into our lungs and oxygen into our bodies in order for it to be used by muscles. Now there's a couple of terms here just to start off with clarifying. VO2 refers to the volume of oxygen that your muscles can use per minute, not breathe but use per minute. So if you're performing a jog or moderate exercise, you'll have a relatively lower VO2 value. Here's a graph that might illustrate this. So as time goes on, these performers, there's two performers, one in the pink, one in the blue, they worked progressively harder, and you can see each kind of peak is where they've gone up a level of intensity on a treadmill actually. So let's look at the blue person first. So their starting point is about 13 or 14 millilitres per kilogram of oxygen per minute. So that's what oxygen they are using. And as the interval starts, the intensity starts, they increase the amount of oxygen that they use. And then there's a gap there's a break in effect before they start again. And you can see the volume of oxygen that their muscles are using is reduced. And then it goes up higher because they're working a bit harder now. And then it goes down, then it goes up higher, then it goes down. So the volume of oxygen that your muscles can use is really critical in aerobic performance. Now you may have heard of the multi-stage fitness test and perhaps some other VO2 max tests. They are tests to try to predict the maximum volume of oxygen your muscles are able to use per minute per kilogram of your body weight. And you can see this blue person here really reached their peak at around 23 minutes, whatever intensity that happened to be. We just don't have that data here. You can see the pink person started at the same intensity or similar intensity, used more oxygen, and actually could go to a higher place. So this person was able to use 55 millilitres of oxygen per kilogram of their body weight per minute before they really fatigued and didn't improve. So we can see that the pink person essentially can use more oxygen per minute. And the respiratory system very much is the way our body has of getting oxygen from the atmosphere inside us, into our blood, and then also from our blood at our muscles, getting it into the muscle cells from the capillaries. So let's look at some basics, and obviously we've just talked really about VO2 max, which is indicated here on this graph. So the respiratory system has three parts to its process. One is called ventilation or pulmonary ventilation. Now in the cardiovascular system there's a term called cardiac output, and that was the volume of blood ejected from the heart per minute. And this is kind of its equivalent. So pulmonary ventilation, now you should recognise that pulmonary is to do with the lungs, and ventilation is the amount of air that you can get in and out of the lungs in a minute. So this is essentially, pulmonary ventilation is the volume of air that you can breathe in and out of your lungs per minute. So we're getting air into our lungs, into our alveoli, and the next step of the respiratory system, or the next role it has, is to get it from our alveoli, our air sacs, into our blood. And this comes by a process called diffusion, which we'll look at later. But this diffusion or gaseous exchange occurring at the lungs is termed external respiration. I guess you can perhaps remember it because this is the gas exchange that happens nearer the external environment, so nearer you're outside the atmosphere and getting it into your blood. So it's external respiration where gases exchange at the lungs between the alveoli and the blood. And of course here we're talking about oxygen coming into the blood and carbon dioxide moving from the blood into the alveoli. Thirdly then, having been in this gap here, the oxygen would have been transported around the body in blood. That's obviously associated with the cardiovascular system. And then it arrives at the muscle site, at the muscle tissues, in some capillaries. And again, we have a process of gaseous exchange that occurs at the muscle site. And this is called internal respiration. And I guess again you could perhaps remember this because it's more inside you. This is nearer the outside and this is much more inside you. So internal respiration is basically oxygen moving from the capillaries into the muscle cells and carbon dioxide moving from the muscles into the capillaries. So 3 steps to the respiratory system: pulmonary ventilation, getting air in and out of your lungs per minute; external respiration, gas exchange at the lungs; internal respiration, gas exchange at the muscles. And questions are sometimes specifically asking you for one or either or sometimes both of these terms and explanations. Broadly speaking, the function of the respiratory system is to provide oxygen. So we've just described its ability to get air into the lungs and ultimately into your blood. And we have these two places, external respiration and internal respiration, where we move gases from one place to another. Also, the respiratory system helps us out by getting rid of our waste products, which is carbon dioxide, through expiration, breathing it out. And again, the carbon dioxide is exchanged at the muscles and at the lungs. This is where it's produced, at the muscles. We get it into our blood, we get it to the lungs, it moves into the lungs and we breathe it out. So simply speaking, the functions are to provide and remove. Now, how is this system structured to do those jobs? Well, the upper tubes or respiratory tracts are essentially, so the nose, the pharynx, the mouth to be fair, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchioles and the bronchi. They basically are tubes which the air passes through. Certain bits of it, so the larynx, the nose, the mouth are, this is a voice box, this has a role in warming air, and the bronchi divide into both lungs, so the air goes into both sides. But these are just tubes to get the air down. And then we've got the lower respiratory system, or the tracts, which is essentially your alveoli, those grape-like air sacs, which are the main places and where gas exchange happened. And they're designed specifically to do that job. Here's an image that you can pause the video and perhaps have a look at more closely. It talks about each of those anatomical position elements and has a little bit of description as to their role and what occurs there. Again, a close-up really of the nasal cavity, just again focusing on some of the anatomy. So the nose, and in through this process, obviously air can go in your mouth also. It's all one, it's joined at the back here. And the nose has an important job in warming air and also filtering out. We've got lots of little air hairs called cilia, which filter out a lot of the debris and the dust particles in the air. So it's a cleaning and warming process. Then air goes down your trachea, your windpipe. You'd be expected to really use the word trachea. And we can see here that it's not a complete circle, and actually it's made of cartilage. So your windpipe is not a solid, it's not solid bone, it's made of cartilage, and there's an important reason for that. You can also see that it sort of is side by side with your food tube, your esophagus, and the epiglottis, which is a flap of tissue at the top of your trachea and esophagus, basically will flap over this gap to allow you to swallow and food to go down your air tube, and it will flap over this side when you breathe in and allow air to go down your lungs. So there are 16 to 20 C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage which basically send air down towards the bronchi, which then divide and go into your left and to your right lungs. And the reason why it's not one solid circle is because if you think about it, you bend and move and turn. Your windpipe, if it was a solid pipe, would be inflexible, and we need our windpipe to be able to accommodate our movements. We're getting near the end now, so this is our trachea, and our trachea divides into our left and right lung, and these are called our bronchi. The singular of this is a bronchus, and they subdivide again into several bronchial trees. So you can see these offshoots here. These are bronchial trees. Bronchioles are smaller air tubes which basically have some smooth muscle tissue in them also. So they have the ability to constrict and dilate. They can narrow and widen. And actually that might relate to sometimes when it's cold, you find it your air tubes will narrow, or asthmatics sometimes they have constricted, so tighter, narrower air tubes, which doesn't make it easy for them to breathe. Again, pause the video, have a little look there. This just labels the air tubes going down into the lungs. Oh, and actually, finally, what this diagram shows is the pleura here. So the parietal and the visceral pleura. These are basically, you can see they circle the lungs. These are sacs. So there's an inner sac and an outer sac, bags if you like. Between those two layers of sac, there's pleural fluid, and this fluid pretty much creates a vacuum. I'm sure you recognise this situation when you've got a glass which might have a bit of moisture on it, and you put it on a beer mat. If you pick the glass up, the beer mat moves with you, and this is how they work. So the outer pleural membrane, this outer layer here, is attached to your rib cage, your thorax. The inner membrane is attached essentially to your lung tissue, and as I said, between them the fluid creates a vacuum. It basically makes them work together, stick together. So if you breathe in and your rib cage, your thorax moves up and out, that will basically pull on the outer membrane, and because of the vacuum that pulls the inner membrane, and because that's connected to the lung tissue will pull apart and essentially widen. And we look at that in more detail in another video. But the pleural membrane basically allow the lung tissue to move with rib cage and diaphragm movements. So there we have it. Lastly, the alveoli. An alveolus is incredibly thin, has incredibly thin walls. They're tiny, tiny air sacs, and we've got millions of them in our lungs. We have lots of them to increase surface area rather than one air sac. But basically, they're tiny thin because the gases then can easily diffuse through the membranes and go through the tiny capillary membranes walls into the blood. So these are designed to maximise surface area and to make diffusion through them easy. So understand from this really that the way we're built, so our respiratory system structure and anatomy, is a lot to do with how it works, and how it works can be described by its physiology, which we look at shortly.